Merci beaucoup pour cette intervention très intéressante et qui, je n'en doute pas, va soulever beaucoup de questions, de débats dans la salle. Si je peux me permettre, c'est un peu une sorte d'économie politique des discours sur la défiance. C'est cette analyse qui est proposée, qui est très intéressante. Je propose peut-être de garder les questions pour la partie débat, donc en fin d'après-midi, de passer la parole tout de suite à notre prochain intervenant donc, qui est avec nous, Mr. Amiel. So I would like to let you the floor, and I would like also, I forgot to mention something that is very important. You are the chairholder of a UNESCO chair on open education and technology for the common good. So thank you, and the floor is yours.
Thank you for the invitation, Philippe and Philippe. It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you all for being here. I will do my best to speak slowly, but it's not a capacity that I normally exercise with competency. So please let me know if I'm speaking too fast. I think this is quite nice the way it worked out. I didn't know what my colleagues were going to speak about earlier, but what I'm actually going to do, which I intended to do all along, was to provide you with an example of what we've been discussing, and I think that it fits quite nicely with the discussions we've had so far. So what I'll tell you is a story that happened just this last year at our university in Brazil, in Brasilia, the capital of Brazil where I am. It's a large public institution of about 50,000 students, not unlike your institution here. And we had a case of a student that was expelled from the university just a few months ago. And the reason he was expelled is because he was recording classes. He had his cell phone in front of him, and he wasn't particularly recording the teacher. He wasn't recording the students. He was recording himself, but he was recording the audio, what was happening there. Now, that could be a trivial discussion about copyright, droit d'auteur, or anything else, or image rights, or whatever you like. And that's how he couched it. But the discussion wasn't about that because it was a political statement, right? The student was there to show how the public university was indoctrinating students to leftist, communist, partial agendas of teaching science rather than teaching a correct version, a technical version of what was happening, a correct vision of what's happening in society, a science, a kind of an unpolluted kind of science. And the student was trying to show examples of what that happened. And of course, in order to do that, he went to courses that were related to history and sociology and humanities in general as a way to showcase this problem. And so this turned out to be a big issue, not only because the student recorded the teachers, but he published the videos online. And he has a channel with 1 million people. And so if we take what the presentation we just had just now, if fake news and disinformation and discredibility of science goes over time along with the media that we use, this is a student with 1 million viewers, which is much more than I think any of us as academics can say. I don't have 1 million followers on my Instagram account. I don't know if you do, but this person had an outreach that we don't have as scientists. And so he was publishing this. Now, what was interesting about this, and this is the reflection I'd like to make, is when people started the contest, if you see the videos of the teachers interacting with the student, they are contesting this based on the ideas of copyrights. Like, this is my class, I own the class, you have no right to record it. Or you are getting the personality rights of the students that are here and their voice, and because you're doing personality rights or moral rights, then you're taking this as something that you shouldn't be able to take. And they wanted for discussions for hours about this, and they were yelling at each other and complaining about this. And it made me think about how misdirected the discussion really is. Because, and again, I think I have a best friend with Professor Juan Babalan right now, because there are so many things that we have in common. I think that the discussion went in the completely wrong direction, which was, how come a student that's at a university, at an undergraduate level, comes in and feels so misrepresented and feels like he's getting such a bad education by getting a version of science that he doesn't believe to be true? An interpreted version of science rather than the science that he was expecting to get. And this is what I think is quite unique. And so I'll point to two topics that I think are worth for our discussion, and they've been brought up here by other colleagues so far. I just kind of complement them with this example. So the first one is that I think over the past 50 years or so, the sociology of science has helped us quite a bit in deconstructing the ideals of what science really is, and this was alluded to earlier. So we don't have, I think, for the past 50 years, the naive idea that science is one monolithic thing that we do. Now, when I went to my undergraduate school 30 years ago, I learned that science was a method and science was a hypothesis. You test the hypothesis, you reject or accept the null hypothesis. That's what I learned. That was 30 years ago. I'm not sure it has changed that much until now. If we introduce science to kids when they're 18 years old, I think we still might do that job. And so science has changed quite a bit, but we don't do a good job of explaining how science changed and how it's contingent and how it's messy and how it's complicated. And it's a particularly difficult thing to do. And it is difficult because I don't think we quite know, if we had to be pressed to explain exactly what demarcates science from non-science. It's not an easy job to do. It's very difficult. I was preparing for this talk, and I was reading this 50-page chapter from Martin Marner. He was a German biologist, where he talks about demarcating science. And it's an interesting exercise because I found myself disagreeing completely with him the whole time, but I really didn't have many good arguments to demarcate science a better way than he had. So just to give you a taste, Martin defines two big blocks, which are anything that is kind of like science or reasonable knowledge, and everything else that is not reasonable knowledge. And within reasonable knowledge, you have two parts. You have hard science that are based on laws, so physics, chemistry, biology, things of that sort. And under it, you have what is considered still to be reasonable knowledge, which is math and humanities and social sciences. And then in the bottom, you have pseudoscience, which is something like astrology, where they're trying to be like a science, but they're really not. And then you have parascience, which is not even trying really hard. It's mysticism and so forth. I don't agree that what I do is not science as an educator, but it opens up the avenue for thinking, I've never been exposed to this as a student, and how do you explain to this as students that where does science really fit, and what does it mean to be credible? What does it mean to find out what the truth is? And how do we pass this information forward? It's quite difficult to do. Now, it doesn't mean that we don't have ways of doing this, but we have to be much more flexible in accepting this. So when the student comes up to you and says what you're teaching is communist science, you can explain to them that that might be a possibility, right? There might be such a thing as communist science, right? And so there are ways of doing this in a more flexible way. And I think that Naomi Oreskes has done a really good job when she talks about her book on what is science as a way of pointing this forward in this contingent manner, right? How do we talk about science? Since science is not a hypothesis testing method only, it's full of different methods. We build science based on consensus, and we build science based on evidence, but we recognize that we have different values, and it's good to have different values in bringing everybody together to dialogue and discuss. That's not what happened with this kid, right? We were talking about copyright when he was actually contending that the science that he was seeing was not something he understood. And we could have engaged with him in a completely different manner, have a completely different discussion, which likely, given the politics of the environment, would have completely thrown him off. That's not what he would be expecting. And it would have been a productive engagement. All right, so that would be, I think, a first point. But the second thing is that the student published this stuff online, right? So to 1 million viewers, and that has an enormous kind of impact. If he had kept it to himself, copyright would have applied, it would have been fine, but he didn't keep it to himself. He put it on a channel with a wider reach than we all have. And if media accompanies scientific development and it influences scientific development, then we have a problem, right? Platforms function and big tech functions in a way that it's very opaque. It's not an open space for discussion. Algorithms are not well known to us, they're a black box. The viewership is not known. And anybody can publish anything, which is the promise of digital culture when I started talking about this topic 20 years ago. That was our promise. Amateurs could talk about everything and it's going to be better for everybody. Based on kind of a naive First Amendment American notion of free speech, right? So the marketplace of ideas would thrive. We realized 20 years later that the marketplace of ideas didn't really thrive. We're focused on dealing with an enormous amount of misinformation, fake news, disinformation, and we don't really know how to deal with this at all. And this is where I think what was alluded to earlier, which is this idea of a political inclination on fake news and disinformation, is quite important. These are not individual people promoting their ideas and having a comfortable discussion in an open space where science should happen, of exchange and consensus building. These are closed environments where we propagate particular kinds of speech to particular kinds of people to influence them in one direction or another. And these are weaponized, right? These are not tools that they're unknown to us, but how they function, but they're being weaponized by the big tech companies themselves. But also, I think we have seen recently, which is quite astonishing, is that the companies themselves are being weaponized by governments. So this was kind of something like a twist we didn't expect until a little while ago. What I mean by this, at least, is that we always knew that big tech corporations dominated the discourse around news, even though they don't pitch themselves as media companies. We know they are media companies. That's where most people get their news. That's where most people get their information. That's where most people get their disinformation. But now, I think it's very clear that media companies or big tech companies are being weaponized by governments to propagate disinformation. And the example that our colleague gave earlier about COVID and then climate change is a very good example, or our distrust in scientific data, I think is a good example of how governments have started to use big tech corporations to reduce fact-checking, to propagate fake information as a weapon of public discourse, which is astonishingly shocking and quite difficult to counteract as scientists. So I think that one of the things that we can think about in terms of what happens next is this idea that how do we ask people, individuals like me, you, us, to counter this through this environment and this discourse that we're flooded with disinformation and distrust of science, and asking people to be media literate, which has been a response, particularly in our government, and has been, I think, a response in many countries around the world, is not the right response. I mean, it's very hard for you to be media literate when you're bombarded with misinformation and disinformation. You have to fact check everything, right? We have better mechanisms to do that. One of the things that I think has happened that is particularly interesting is that over the past 10 years, we've gone away from the idea that the internet is going to be this wonderful place of digital culture and sharing. We realize that that's not the place. Now, it's not the internet I expected when I was starting, in the 80s. We're definitely a very different internet than we were. Today, we have an internet that needs much more and much stronger regulation, and there's no doubt about that. So if you look at the Code of Conduct for Disinformation here in Europe through the Digital Service Act that has been enacted now as an enforcement mechanism this year, I think this Code of Conduct is one way forward, which makes the platforms far more responsible for what they publish online. And the same thing has happened in Brazil. Our Supreme Court just judged last month that platforms are particularly responsible for the content that they publish online, especially if it's monetized. So if you're making money out of this, and there's obviously a bias involved, you should be able to be held responsible for this content, and you should be liable to take it down even without a judicial order. This was unthinkable until 2 or 3 years ago. We never thought this was possible. It was a clausula petra. It was a center piece of our understanding of the internet, that platforms were neutral and that they would have to circulate content independently of being judged by the content of the users, right? So users were free to post anything that they wanted and platforms would not be held liable to it. And this has changed quite a bit because we are in an environment where people distrust information, distrust scientific information, and we have to regulate it somehow, right? Things have changed quite a bit. So to finish up, we don't have a lot of time. I'd be interested in hearing, particularly from the students, if you feel this resonates with you or not. If you have this difficulty in explaining your versions of science and how do you feel about this plurality of understanding of sciences, if you feel like your understanding of science is complete and you have a good grasp of the subject, or if we should be talking more about what science actually means and how do we all interpret science differently so we can have a more productive dialogue in moving forward with this in the future. Thank you.
So thanks a lot. So indeed, we have maybe time for 1 or 2 questions. Or students, you have been asked maybe to share your point of view. I've got one question for you, maybe. Oh, there is one.
Just because you made a statement about, well, you made a question for the students, and I think that perhaps I could, well, with my experience, answer that. About the about the things you pointed. It is sometimes a little bit difficult to place ourselves in this word because it's not particularly, in our case, of course, the studies we are on. For example, for me, I'm not studying something with science at all. I mean, scientific, like economic science, okay, but so it is quite difficult to answer this question because it's not our field exactly.
I think you kind of helped us answer the question already. I think it's a good point that you made. When you say you don't recognize what you do as science, it opens up a really good avenue for discussion already.
Yeah, of course. And also other part of it is that I think that yes, we can consider, well, like we said before, law, some brute science, etc. Economics should be science, but the way it is done is not the same at all. When you tell me about science, I think already of like. In France, what we used to say as SVT, what is not the same at all. But yeah, I hope I helped out.
Thank you for that.
I was wondering if you classify propaganda as misinformation.
Personally?
Yeah,
More and more, yes, I think so. And not because of, do you mean propaganda as advertisement, propaganda as political propaganda?
both.
Okay, then two different things, I think. So political propaganda is most political propaganda today is fake news. I mean, it's again weaponized advertising. I think that if you're advertising a product, I think we still have reasons for advertising products. But what are the things that apply to both? To make I think a point clear is one of the things that we're demanding platforms to do now is to tell us where these things are coming from, because they both have in common the idea that they're paid for, right? These are things that are sponsored by money. And one interesting argument from this kid, going back to the story, is somebody asked him and said, well, you're making money out of this stuff that you're putting online, you're monetizing. He has a YouTube channel, he makes money off of this. And he says, in a typical response you would expect from this kind of kid, he said, well, what's the conflict of interest? I can make money and still believe in what I'm saying, right? And there is a conflict of interest when you're paying for something, right? You're directing the public, you're using these machines to direct public directly to the kind of people you want to target, vulnerable people, people that will like your message, people that are going to be influenced by your message. And I think that it becomes a form of negative propaganda, and a lot of times of fake news, because you're going to influence people directly in a topic that might not be prepared or vulnerable to, increasingly more than it would be, for example, if you were watching TV and you saw an advertisement, right? Quite different scenario. You're vulnerable because you're sick, you're vulnerable because you're mentally ill, you're vulnerable because you're a target group. Let me show you this advertisement. That's quite different than you're watching TV and you just happen to see something. So I would say so. That's my personal